As a vintage pattern seller for 10 years, I can tell you, hooded patterns are extremely popular all the time. So of course, when things like that happen, companies go, hey, I'm gonna make it again. Hi, my name's Stephanie Canada. In case you don't know me, yes indeed, I have been selling vintage sewing patterns for the better part of 10 years, and yes, I talk way too fast, all the time. And you've stumbled onto another episode of Vintage versus Reproduction, where I take an original 1940s pattern and compare it to its modern counterpart. In today's adventure, we're going to be dealing with Simplicity 3322 versus Simplicity 8477, the modern reproduction. In case this is your first time clicking on one of these videos, yes indeed, my name is Stephanie Canada, just like the country, and no, I don't live there. And what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be taking each of these patterns and I'm going to be comparing them line for line. Now, in case you haven't caught this video right here where I sort of explain why I hate the reproduction patterns, I'm going to give you a real quick rundown. The company in this matter is going to be Simplicity, which back in the early 2000s, when the retro patterns were coming back into style, asked for donations to try and get some of their old patterns back so that they could reproduce them because they did not actually have an entire library of their old patterns, wabam, to go ahead and reproduce from. Now, in previous episodes of this, you've seen me do a jiffy dress, a caftan, and a toddler dress, where in some cases it is very clear that they got the donation and then decided to change it of their own will because they felt like it. And other times, maybe they had a donation, maybe they didn't, and they just redrafted as they saw it, jiffy dress, because the changes were so large that it was very noticeable. And I'm also just gonna lay down some basic expectations today. Now, while I understand that a lot of you would really like to see me make the vintage version and the reproduction version up in some type of completed format so you could really see the differences side by side, at this point it's not really feasible. Because with 4,200 subscribers, on my 1930s Vintage Vogue vintage versus reproduction dress, I made exactly that much. Seriously. If I were to have bought this pattern outright, this would barely cover what it cost. So now, is this something I would like to bring to you in the future? Absolutely. And to that end, what I have done is I have actually started a Ko-fi account. Yay! Coffee, Ko-fi, I don't know. I'm gonna say it coffee because that's my favorite drink. So that's what we're going with. So that way I have put myself a little goal in there so that way I can figure out how much it would take me to do one of these projects from beginning to end with all the time that it takes to actually make both pieces. And I will put that total in there. And so if that's something you'd like to see in the future, you can feel free to go ahead and donate to that end. Or if you just generally enjoy my content and want to see more things on the channel and want to just leave me a tip and say, hey, thanks for taking the time to do this, you can also do that there. There's absolutely no pressure though. I just want to let you know that that is an opportunity. If you would like to see me make these garments, that's really how we're going to be able to get these to the channel. Now, the other thing I will bring up is that if I do actually do these things where I make these up fully, don't be surprised to see said fabric and everything reused multiple times. Because a lot of the reasons that I also haven't done this, not only because of time and money, it's also because it's very wasteful. If I were to make this pattern, which is very lovely, but a bust size 30, it wouldn't fit my thigh. The other way to combat the wastefulness of this is that maybe I would take each piece in its vaguely completed state and then I would raffle it off. Either way, let me know if you like either of those options, whether or not you're okay with seeing it cut up multiple times, you know, start with a big dress and then get it down to the small pieces. Or if you would rather me make these pieces and then raffle them off, knowing that the product that you're going to get is probably not 100% finished and you're gonna have to do just a little bit of tweaking and or maybe adding a zipper along the way. Because probably what I would do is get this to the point of vaguely complete so that it could go onto a mannequin and not ready to wear. So if you want your very own delivered UFO from Stephanie, let me know. It also has to deal with the environmental impact of buying new things or even thrifted things and then making them into garments that never get used. It's hard for me. It would be easier, absolutely, if folks are like, yes, raffle it off. Then I'm like, great, someone else is going to take this project and finish it off just for them. But it just doesn't quite make sense in how I like to live my life with as small a carbon footprint as possible. So after that ridiculously long-winded statement, we're gonna go ahead and keep going the educational route, which is where I just take the patterns, I lay them over top of each other, and then I measure them so that y'all can know the differences. Because at this point, that seems the most practical and educational way, so that way you can take maybe this reproduction pattern and make it for yourself a little closer to the vintage. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. But before we go any farther, I want to thank my dear friend Felix for letting me borrow this amazing vintage pattern. You should go check out her profile over on Instagram.
We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
And we will be going through in our standard order of looking at the envelopes, looking at the instructions, and then diving into the pattern piece by piece so we can see the differences. Now though, first off, I do want to say that we are dealing with 2 different bust sizes because, as we know from that video right there, that sizes have drastically changed from the early 1940s to now. So for today's size differences, we'll be dealing with a size 12, which is a bust 30, a waist 26, and a hip of 33. And a size 6, which is a 30.5, 23, and 32.5. You don't get to a size 26.5 inch waist until you get to a 12. Let's dive right in to the envelope, where we can see that our 40s one only has the line drawings, and our modern one, while actually does include all of the original line drawings, it also has a made-up version on the model as well. Though the downside to this is I really think that if you were going to do a complete look, you should have had, I understand why they did the Rosie the Riveter thing, but I would have rather seen this hooded version and see how that made up in real life, as opposed to just the same outfit over again in the Rosie the Riveter pose. But I also understand that that can lean heavily into the costume aspect of it so that it serves a double purpose for selling, which I understand. And other than that, the fronts aren't that terribly different, so that's fine. And as always, the modern is a multi-line pattern. One thing to note on the front is that I still wish they would put the original pattern numbers as well as the new pattern numbers. But again, that's just because I'm a purist and I would like to know the original numbers and not have to hunt it down through the miasm of the internet. And then on the back, we can see that we start here with a little description, the body sizes, the materials required, suggested fabrics and notions, and then what pattern pieces you're looking for. And then on the back of the modern one, you can see the number, the fabrics and the notions, what measurements you're looking for, what sizes they equate to, sizes. And then you can also see here that there is actually all types of different widths of fabric and how much you'll need for each. And then finally down here, which is kind of nice, you get the finished garment measurements, which you don't normally get, and by normally I mean ever, on vintage patterns. So that actually is nice so you can see what the finished garment measurements are versus what your body measurements are. So it's already telling you the ease in your pattern. But one thing to note is that since I don't know that here for our vintage pattern, that we're just gonna have to do our best between lining up the standard bodice measurements for the vintage in the modern and see if we can figure out some type of differences, because I feel like they're going to be vast with the measurement differences in these two. But we're gonna give it the good old college try. Speaking of college try, let's head on to the instructions. One other thing to note, I actually did borrow this pattern from a dear friend of mine, so these instructions have absolutely not been ironed. Why? Because this tear right along here, if I were to put an iron to it, would make it either A, completely torn apart from one another, or B, would destroy whatever is left along these little fringes here. So I'm not willing to do that, so I do apologize. It's gonna be a little bit more wrinkly than usual. Thankfully though, the pattern was in way better shape, so I was able to actually iron that flat, but the instructions, not so much. So when we look at the vintage instructions, they look pretty usual as far as vintage instructions go. Up here you have a black and white version of the exact same front cover, and then next to it you're going to get your steps in dressmaking. It's gonna tell you your notches that you need right there. Again, it's going to tell you all of the pieces, but this time with a little bit more detail. You can see here where you can see if you want to cut it short sleeve or stay long sleeve. And it actually goes through and kind of really tells you what the notches are. So if you ever do come across vintage patterns, always check this inside part because sometimes they do have this little breakdown. So you know that these notches right here, that's where the pocket goes. They really do try to make it a little bit easier if you just read through all the instructions. I know it can be a little frustrating at first because it's not as clear as modern instructions are. However, there are actual denotations for most of this stuff, so you just have to kind of work through it slowly. I believe in you. You can do it. Then over on the far side, we can see that it says to adjust the pattern here. You got your lengthen and shortens and how to do it safely without using tape, please. Use pins and tissue paper. Or just trace it out and don't cut the actual vintage pattern. That's what I do. And it actually gives you little tips about what you do before you move the pattern and how to make a tailor's tack, which is my preferred method of marking fabric, because apparently I'm old. Meh. So then down at the bottom, you have the overall cutting layouts for basically everything you're looking at. Blouse with hood, blouse with collar, slacks, slacks and hood facing, and overalls. And also it does give you a little blurb right here of like some cutting notes as like a, hey, don't forget about me. Then on to the back. We're gonna start off with some general sewing instructions, which are always good to know. This is actually where in this particular pattern, you're gonna find the seam allowance differences, where it's gonna let you know that the small dots that indicate the 3/4 inch seam allowance under the arms, which is quite a lot. But it says there that it's to allow for the alterations. And the other seam allowances are all going to be a 1/2 inch. So the only time when we are comparing the two, need to look for differences is going to be on that underarm of the blouse, which is good to know. And then it's just gonna generally go through all your steps, except for this very bottom part that's gonna tell you like details of seam finishing, how to do a single bias facing, worked buttonholes, etc. But it's really compact so that it can all stay onto one sheet, which for my weirdo brain, that's what works really well. But I know it's not for everyone. Now, let's look at the modern ones and see how they differ.
A few moments later.
Now for the modern ones, there's a big thing that I notice. You have 1 with a backside, 2 with a backside, all with instructions. And it says up here, because we purchased this in the US, it does say English and Spanish. And so I have a completely separate Spanish packet as well, which is all of the actual worded instructions and the measurements in Spanish. Whereas in the vintage one, the only thing you're gonna get is English. At least for this pattern that I found in the United States. So now what exactly do we see? An overall piece layout. But again, I think they did themselves a slight disservice, never showing the hood fully up in this version. And then we have a pattern layout, which is actually a little bit less detailed than even in the vintage one. And then a general direction section, some special cutting notes, which we saw in the other pattern as well. General sewing instructions, which is always great if you're just starting out. And then down at the bottom here, I will give them this. This is laid out pretty well. There's not a whole giant gaping white spaces. Like I feel like there's enough white space that your brain can put it together, but not so much white space that I go, why did you waste time with this? So that's nice. But you have pants, overalls, interfacing bits, and blouse. And then, oh, we do have a little bit of Spanish over here. Okay, so that's good. So they did fit some Spanish onto this version. To the back side we go, haha. Oh, okay. Speaking of things not being as detailed, they just pushed the rest of the layouts to the back of this page, because here we can see the contrast hooded facing, the interfacing, the blouse, and more interfacing. Sure, that's fine. Okay, with the layout and the way it is, I sort of understand why it had to go over to the back. And it does notate it here, so that way you know when you're looking at this page to flip it over as well. All right, so I guess in that case, sure, that's fine. And then you have some just very large sewing directions, so that way in case you don't have a sewing book, they're gonna go ahead and tell you in the instructions here, and then we just jump right into it. So the pants and overalls, but the one thing I wanna know, what's the seam allowance? Do we have the same seam allowances? That's the key. Where the f***ing hell are you? All right, so according to the instructions, which sometimes have turned out to not be true when you actually look at the pattern pieces, but we'll get there. So the seam allowance on your modern one is going to be 5/8 of an inch, which on the underarm should be 1/8 inch too small. And on the every other seam that there is, it should be 1/8 inch too big. So we'll see how that goes. And then on the back, we just have more instructions. That probably tells me there's a lot of in the usual style on the vintage ones, but we aren't here to delve too much into the instructions because the modern ones always add in more detail than the vintage ones do. This we know because of just the innate home economic experience of the modern sewist. But now the part you've all been waiting for. Let's go ahead and dive into the pattern pieces, where I will be using my lovely cloth tape measure and putting the vintage on top and the modern on bottom, because that's how it should be. The other thing to note is that I will be going through the pattern pieces as the vintage one puts it, so starting with A and going all the way down, which means we're going to start with the piece that I think the vintage actually did a disservice, which is the blouse. Now remember, in this we should be lining up our 12, which is a 1 size pattern, with a size 6, with possibly a waist that goes all the way up to somewhere between a 10 and a 12. Sure. And really, there shouldn't be any other changes, right? Let's just say we're not starting off strong. I don't know how to properly convey this to you. This is supposed to be a blouse. It's not supposed to be that difficult. No. Just no. Okay. I have my big center marks. I have my 6 lined up. Your neck is definitely wider. The curve of the shoulder goes right dead in between an 8 and a 10. The arm's eye, so like it stays right with the 8 pretty much until the curve of the arm. So it looks like the arm's eye is smaller on the vintage one. It's smaller by 1/4 of an inch. So if you want a more vintage arm's eye, you need to nudge that up 1/4 of an inch. This pattern piece goes out to the size 10 almost, within like a 1/16 of an inch. Wow, didn't think we were gonna start off this badly. All right, so as you run along down, by the time you get to the final 3/4 inch dart seam allowance notation, it's at the size 8 line. And yes, my nails, I am repping Holo Taco today, so there you go, supporting way larger YouTubers than me. You are 1 1/8 inch shy to 1 5/8 inch shy. And then along the far side, you start down at the corner at 3/4 of an inch. And then by the time you get to the first center line notation, you are 1 inch. By the time you get to the second, you are, holy cow. You're starting to see the curve of the modern pattern, but the vintage one is basically a straight line up to the edge here. And by the time you get up here, you are 3/8 of an inch away from the 6. So the curve is, this is much more of a straight fold over, whereas this one is much more curved. And then the neckline here, 7/8 of an inch into the neckline of the modern one. And then you do sort of follow the same curve down. And here at the fold line, no, center front line, here at the center front line, you are 1/4 inch to get to the modern. So from the 6, you're basically at the 8 up until you get to the 6 point. Okay, well, that's a good start, she says nervously. Let's move on to the second piece, which is gonna be the blouse back. Let's start on the positive. We'll try and stay positive. It'll be fine. The pleat line isn't that bad. You're probably a 1/16 of an inch away or less. The center back line's up straight. For some reason, some unknowing reason, the blouse back is almost the exact same. The vintage is shorter by 1/4 of an inch. I don't understand how the front of this was so much different. Maybe it's because they left everything on the table because they did this. Like, the actual crap. So first off, we followed the neckline of the 6 basically until the dart notation of the modern one. And then it takes a sharp turn in the vintage. It's really hard to kind of explain this. So I'm just gonna sort of show you here how different it is. So by the time we get to where the 6 the 6 point, God, I hate multi-line patterns. You are 1 inch into the pattern and 1/4 inch down to the tip of the vintage one. So basically draw yourself a little line out and a little line down, make a mark, and then use your French curve to go from the dart of the modern one and go up to that point. That's your vintage shoulder line. Because honestly, the only thing to tell you is that there is some type of notation close to where the other one is. But basically this little hole right here, this marking for the 14, is almost where your sleeve is, the top of your shoulder is. You're 1/8 of an inch off if you kind of line up that and shoot the line straight down. And you'll want to terminate the shoulder line basically right at the size 10. Maybe a 1/16 of an inch past it. Yeah, that's cool. That's great. Love that. Buddy. Then, arm's eye actually isn't that bad. It's basically after the shoulder line notation where it juts out super far, it curves back in almost immediately to the size 6. And it stays to the size 6 until about the second little circular notation of the modern one. And then it sort of goes into the 8, and then by the time you get just past the double notation down here, you are looking at a 1/4 inch past your double markings on the size 6. That's where your lines are meeting up again. And then you want to make a mark on your size 6 that is 3/8 of an inch down and curve it down to that point. That will get you the correct vintage arm's eye. So then what you do is you stay all the way basically on the size 6, all the way down until you get to the curve at the bottom where you want to trim it in 1/4 of an inch. And that will get you the blouse back that you want for the vintage one. That's super easy. Oh, did I mention that B was number 9 and that A is number 17? I love how they make these line up. The other thing to note is that as I'm giving you all these measurements, then you will need to make sure that you are using the vintage seam allowance of 1/2 inch, except for the underarm, which is 3/4 of an inch. And that will give you your vintage look using your modern pattern. You got this. All right, well, here comes my favorite part. I always love a good hood. What? Say what now, y'all? This is why I have trust issues. On the vintage one, these 3 holes denote the center, back, and fold of the material. So this goes here, right? So this is gonna be the top. The modern one, put the center back seam there. And then the center fold is supposed to be your top for the modern one. Okay, it's fine. It's fine. Until you look at the rest of it and then you realize it's not fine. For some godforsaken reason, they decided to add pleats to the modern one. There's an extra curve that doesn't need to be there. And it just... vintage? Modern. I could sit here and measure it and try and tell you what to do, but I'm telling you right now, it's a complete redraft. Which is, for a modern sewist that is trying to reproduce a vintage garment, these are already taxing. Why are you making it harder than it needs to be, Simplicity? This is not this. They are not the same. God, that makes me mad. And this is why I say, please try vintage patterns first before you get nervous about them. Because the modern ones make things harder than it needs to be. And I'm sorry, you're gonna get a lot of banging, but that pisses me off. Okay, so we're not gonna give up. We're gonna see if I can get this for you. Step 1, ignore all the pleat notations. Don't do it. If you just cut it out, don't do it. You're gonna straighten out this center line here. Go from the tip and go 1 inch from the corner and make a straight line 1 inch along this curve. Then you're gonna follow this curve. I am following the vintage pattern so you can sort of see how to do this. Because somewhere right here, basically right at the point that it tells you to hold your 3rd pleat, that's your point where it lines up again. So you want to take your French curve and you want to notate all through here. Get this line to match up as close as you can. It's not going to be perfect, but that's okay. We're just trying to get this a better silhouette for the 1940s, as opposed to this monstrosity that looks like a hoodie that you would wear in your school class in the early 2000s. How do I know? 'Cause I lived it. Then from there, you want to continue that line. You actually want to straighten out the curve because the curve basically stops here. And then you're going to take basically a straight line down, funnily enough, right here at the 3/8 inch seam allowance allowed, which is complete crap, and that's why I hate and I don't trust modern patterns, because they change your seam allowances all the time. Right at the end of that E, that's where my vintage pattern lines up. And then if you go from that E and go down 5/8 of an inch, past where the line and the E are, go straight down. It's still gonna be a little off, y'all, because this is so different, but I'm doing my best for you. Then your hood is 1/4 inch outside the modern line. And then from this point that you made here to this point that you made here, sort of pretend like it's an edge of the face curve. So there's a slight bevel out and a slight bevel in. It's not gonna be perfect. And honestly, if you wanted to just do like a rounded curve or a straight line, that would also work too. But don't do this hood, basically. This hood is hot garbage as far as maintaining the 40s look. No. Let's play the game of flood this video into Simplicity's inbox. Maybe they'll start paying the attention. I don't know. Maybe just ask vintage sellers. Or I don't know, buy them back so you can do it the right way. Okay. Collars. What can go wrong with a collar? It's not as bad as the hood. That's a really low bar. Okay, well, are we surprised it doesn't line up? Nope. No, we're not. Not at this point. It does line up along the outer edge. So from the 6 to the edge, that's all correct. However, what does change is actually the curvature of this interior where it connects to the neckline is changed. But that's also because the neckline of the vintage one was different and much more shallow as opposed to a wider set collar. So only take these notations if you intend to change the blouse collar width like I described. If you don't use the modern collar, it's not that bad. But if you do, you want to trim into your 1/6 by 1/4 of an inch, and you want to make it wider to the edge 1/8 of an inch. Anyway, we're gonna go to the sleeve. Oh, I'm just gonna say it. They probably took a much more early 1940s pattern with a little poof and decided to poof this one because that's not what this looks like. So what I have done is I have lined up the bottom curves of each of the sleeve lines. And now we're gonna take our little measuring tape and tell you how much the arm curve has changed. Let's do that. So even to get to the 6, you have to go 1 1/8 inches to get to where the modern curve is. So the best bet is, if you feel like redrafting it, drop it down 1 1/8 inches and then recurve with some other sleeve pattern because you don't line up again until the very bottom. So none of this curve is present in the vintage. So by the time you get to the single darted side, you're actually into the size 10 curve when you get to the notch. And over on the double notch side, after the double notch, you're starting the drop down and then it curves over. So it's basically a much more rounded curve as opposed to like poofier curve that they're giving you here. If you enjoy sleeves with poof, use the modern one. If you want to make it much more like the 1940s rationed look, then just pull that curve down overall. The length actually is pretty close. Is actually pretty. It's like spot on. The length is spot on, so that's fine. But I will say that if on the single notch side for both patterns, instead of staying at the 6 line, you're at the 8 line, and on the double notch side, you are at the 12. So the vintage one is giving you much more room in your sleeve. Other than that, sleeve's not the end of the world. Let's move on to the cuff, which is letter F to number 24. And all right. So even though the vintage was the one with the wider sleeve, the cuff of the vintage is smaller than the modern one. Oh my God. Okay, so if you want the vintage cuff, you need to... So if I'm lined up along the notch side there, what I am looking at is I'm looking at 1/8 of an inch shorter on the bottom side. And I am looking at 5/8 of an inch shy on the other. It's basically just allowing your sleeve to have more volume at the wrist. So if you like your wrist to have a little bit more room to move, again, use the modern, perfectly fine. If you want it to be a bit more vintage, just trim it in a little bit and make it work for you. Is that enough? Oh no, there's a pocket, right.
A few moments later.
Now that I found the pocket on a random extra piece of tissue paper, I was about to say, hey, good job, Simplicity. You put all of those pieces on one piece of tissue. Except the pocket. So close. Yeah, along the bottom it looks like it's a 1/4 inch difference through here and here. But all the sides are an 1/8 inch difference, which is the seam allowance, so that's not bad. That's all right. Use the modern one. It's fine. You get an extra 1/4 inch at the bottom. Huzzah! But before we leave the blouse, let's go ahead and talk about some of the pieces that just don't exist in the vintage one. First and foremost being My least favorite pieces in patterns? The back neck facing. I just hate them perpetually. Now, the reason why the modern one has it and the vintage one does it is because the vintage one actually tells you in the instructions to go ahead and put that finish on with just bias facing, not an actual piece. Remember that rationing was a strong part of this, and so bias facing was a lot smaller and used less fabric as opposed to an actual facing. So that explains that piece. This, oh god, monstrosity here of piece 25 in the modern one is all buttonhole guide. You didn't need a separate piece for it because the actual perforated pattern just has it punched in for you. The modern one can't do that because they're already confusing enough with that ridiculous multi-lined spaghetti stuff. And another piece you don't see is the front interfacing. That could also be partially because of rationing and really just trying to use as little material as possible. So it's not a piece that I would say that you need to skip if you're going to make a true version of this, because honestly, interfacing holds buttonholes and buttons. So I would use it if I were making it. But I would make it off of the vintage pattern piece, not off of this, if I was doing it that way. The other piece that you don't see is going to be the pocket band. And that's because in the vintage instructions, it just tells you to cut a 2 1/4 wide inch strip of bias instead of giving you that rectangle. It would be a little annoying if you'd cut all the pieces and hadn't seen that, so I do understand why some people prefer the modern ones for that, because it actually just gives you the pieces. But it's just something to know. That's all. Time for the pants! After the rest of this, I can only imagine that's going to be terrible! Great. I will remind you that the pattern for a size 6 is supposed to have a 23.5 inch waist. No, 23 inch waist. And my vintage one is supposed to be a 26 inch waist. Sure. Wrong. At least so that one side is more wrong than the other. When you look at the pattern, I have lined up the top left corner. And I've done my best to hold the curve for as long as I possibly could along this godforsaken pattern until it just goes awry toward the bottom. So by the time you get to the bottom, your pants are 1/2 inch wider, basically to the size 10 line on the piece that is 6, 10, 14. Ay. The vintage is 1.5 inches shorter. The only thing I can think of is if they're too long, you can thank Modern Simplicity for it. Also, just the general leg shape is wrong too. Fun fact. They have done a much more tapered leg here, whereas the vintage one is much more straight leg. So the width. If at the lengthen or shorten mark on the actual modern pattern, that's where you really start to see the curve out of this pattern begin, because at that point you're already 1/8 of an inch into the size 10 marking. And by the time you get to the finish point of the vintage, you are at the 10 line. So start your curve out and start to try to taper out to a 10. And then if you want the length, leave it to the regular length and then deal with it from there. The modern one is giving you like a 3-inch hem, which is not correct. They should have only been about 1.5 inches worth of fold back, not what they've given you. And then on the end, the actual length, on one side you're to the 10, and on the far side, you are another 1.25 inches past your line. From that 1.25 inches, basically draw a straight line up to the 6. The 6 is crotch notation, but leave it a 1/2 inch short because that's where your crotch ends. So the crotch of the modern is a 1/2 inch lower. That's your pant line, friends. So you have way more room in the vintage one than you do in the modern ones. And then as far as, so follow the curve basically of the 14, and that's your vintage line. The pleats are actually correct for the size 6. So there you go, Simplicity, you got the pleats right. Frackin'. Right, well that was enlightening. Let's go to the other side. So we're basically seeing the same problems that we saw on the pants front with the pants back. What I have done this time is lined up with the upper right side being lined up, trying to keep the curve of the front as close to the modern 6 as I can. What's interesting is the vintage dart is 1 inch longer and 1/4 inch less wide. So they took a narrower, longer dart as opposed to the modern darting. Darting honestly is so up to preference that it doesn't even really matter how different that is. I will say the dart placement in the curvature of the pants is both correct. However, the overall width is not. So along the top, the pants are 3/8 of an inch shallower. And if you follow the curve of the back line, it's basically a nice even 3/8 and then continue closer to the size 12 until you go 5/8 of an inch past it. Then from that 5/8 inch mark, by the time you get to the bottom, you're looking at a 2 3/8 inch difference of pant width. If I'm being honest, folks, the pants aren't even close. The vintage ones are so much wider. They're also 1 3/4 inch shorter at the bottom as well. Should I be surprised by this anymore? No, I shouldn't. But here I am, hopeful every time, and gets just dashed on the floor. You know what's comical? When things match up. The waistband. To a size 6. Lines up. Let me repeat that. The waistband on a vintage 26-inch waist lines up to a modern 23-inch waist size pattern. Make it make sense. This should not line up. Of all the things that should not line up, this is it. I think even the center back marking lines up. Oh my God, it does. The center back marking lines up. The center front marking is only off by like 1/4 of an inch. Make it make sense. We're not gonna dwell on that dumpster fire. Now moving on to the bodice front. Yep. Now really it's not that big of a deal that the modern one only asks you to cut one, whereas the vintage one would have you cut it on the fold. That's really no big deal. That's fine. They even give you the little notation here so you know where the center is, so I'm assuming that if you wanted to just cut it on the fold, you could. We'll start with the angle being wrong along the bottom. Basically just follow the size 14 line, because that's the actual line of the vintage here. The other thing you'll notice about the modern one is that it does not have this little self-face flap. I'm pretty sure that's actually a whole separate piece that you have to make, which is neither here nor there. As far as the lines matching up, you're pretty close to where the 6 crosses over the 12 mark here in the bottom. However, you rapidly go out of the picture. So the vintage is an 1/8 inch over, past the 6 here. By the time you get to this little dart point, you are at the 10 line. Might as well just follow that until you get to this angle here. Then from here, actually into the 10, you are up into this line. However, I will say the seaming lines are pretty close to where the 6 is. They're not spot on, but they're close until you get to right here where it's actually at the size 10 line, and I'm still lined up down here at the bottom center. Yeah, so again, in the vintage one, because there was rationing happening, all you're doing along the far edge there is you were just supposed to fold over those 1/2 inches, and that was your facing. And then you do a hem facing. So you do a thin hem facing, then you fold it along those perforated marks. And then the facing up the top was the only thing that you had to deal with as far as like folding that over for the main part of the facing. And amazing how adding that tiny little flap up top means that now you don't have to do this whole extra piece down here. Ain't that lovely? But considering how the hood looked, I'm actually pleasantly surprised that it wasn't that bad. Shows you just how low my standards are. Oh, don't even get me started about the buttons. They're all wrong. But put buttons wherever you want buttons. That is my always. It's always put buttons where you want buttons, not necessarily where they want them. I always mess with where the buttonholes are. I mark them in as a guide, and then I just do whatever I want. I just realized the darting's actually a 1/2 inch. Oh no, that's 3/4 of an inch more shallow on the vintage one. So if you want it to look more like the vintage, shorten your modern dart by 3/4 of an inch. And then if you want to have the more vintage look, you want to trim it in by 1/8 of an inch on either side as well after you move it 3/4 of an inch in. Okay, let's see how much they f***ed up the back. All right, so this is our little reminder that the vintage one is supposed to have more shallow of seam allowance by 1/8 of an inch all the way around. And yet, it's way bigger. What's funny at this point, and it's only funny because it's comically bad, I think they got this pattern in a donation, but it was missing the hood. That's my guess. Because most of this vaguely lines up, and that top lining up for the overalls is a little too close. So I think they got this in a donation, but it was missing the hood. Or maybe it was missing the whole blouse, which is why the whole blouse was like really off. Anyway, let's go back to the back. All right, so if you line it up in the bottom corner here, it follows the line for the 8, but then terminates halfway between the 6 and the 8. So make your point there. And you want to stay outside of the 6 line all the way along, same way, like right in between. But once you get, so from the top of the 6, you want to go past it 1 1/8 inch. And then curve it along, I'd say follow the 14 line, because the 14 line looks like it's 3/8 of an inch. Yeah, it's pretty much 3/8 of an inch all the way along. So follow the 14 line, 3/8 of an inch, making little notations, and stay there. That'll give you the more appropriate vintage back look. And the attachment point for whatever perforation they have given you for the 6 is 3/8 inch above the 6 mark on the modern. I don't even know what that's for. That's a mess. Put the shoulder straps wherever they fit on you, because this is, don't go off of this crap. Make it work for you. Do not go off of their notations, 'cause they're a mess. That's actually almost correct. So what you're looking at here is basically a seam allowance difference along the entire strip, but the strap for the vintage is quite honestly a 1/16 inch longer. And the button placement is actually in the same spot. This is actually fine. The shoulder strap is fine. There you go. See, I can be positive every once in a while when they do it, right? All right, what's the last one? R, what are you? Letter R is the overall belt, as opposed to the pants belt, which we saw earlier. Letter R translate to piece number 15. And they, for some reason, gave you every single individual one for this one. So again, gonna remind you, this is the waistband for the overall version, which again, I have the vintage 26 to a modern 23. Hey look, the first time a difference actually makes f***ing sense. The buttonhole does line up on the far side, but this is the first time that my vintage piece, which should be larger, actually is larger. And it is larger by 1 1/4 inches along the backside. But I think you're, oh no, you do cut 2 of these.
One eternity later.
So this waistband situation. What the vintage one does is it has you connect the bodice and the pants first, and then take the one singular piece of the belt that you have cut and stitch it so that it's along the middle of those 2 pieces. The modern one is giving you 2 pieces of waistband, one for the front, one for the back, having you stitch them to the bodice first, then attach the bodice and the pants, and then fold over that belt piece. Personally, I prefer the vintage because that means there's less bulk at the waistline because you only have one piece and it's on the exterior of the garment as opposed to the interior. The interior can be finished off by pinking shears or by overcasting. Let's look at the pants pocket. Rounding out our pieces that we actually have. Yeah, okay, that's not bad. That's, again, pretty much just the seam allowance difference and then a 1/4 inch extra on the bottom. Exact same as the top pocket. So not too shabby. That's actually all right. But Stephanie, what about all those extra pieces? Well, friends, that's, I mean, are we surprised? First up, there's just duplicates on some. You can see here, 8 and 8. Ain't it lovely? And over here, I have an underlap that's supposed to go along the side, which the vintage does tell you to do as well, but again, it doesn't give you the actual piece for it. It just tells you in the instructions what size it's supposed to be. I'm not even going to bother measuring it because I can almost guarantee that it's wrong. And we already discussed the interfacing pieces. And then the same for the back facing. They give you a back facing on this, which is funny because then that may make it a 5/8 inch even less because, oh dear heavens. Whereas the vintage on the back just has you do that same hem facing with a really thin level of stitching, and then you fold it over that 1/2 inch. So this front facing piece here, nope, 2.5 inches. Of course not. Why would they actually make that the same size? That actually is, but in the vintage it's labeled as a 3-inch wide piece. We've talked about the pocket pants band just not being a thing because, again, that was just a described piece, not a given piece. And the only other piece I see is this underlap here, which goes onto the pants section, which we talked about earlier, is described in the instructions, but not actually given. Final thoughts. Well, I do hope this video helped you out today, in hopes that you can use a actual retro pattern and actually turn it into more of the vintage, authentic look that you were going for. And if you think these are fun for me, you'd be massively incorrect, because I would rather gouge my eyeball out with a rusty spork. They're not so bad when it's actually something that's a little bit closer to the actual pattern that I'm measuring, but then when you come across things like that hood, there's just a level of murder in my eyes that comes through. Because why? Like I said, the only reason I can think that that pattern piece is so different is because it was missing from the original pattern that they got gifted. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you click that like button down below, being sure to comment and let me know which patterns you'd like me to keep an eye out for. Like I always said, I do keep an eye out for them all the time, but I like to make a list so that way in case I find the vintage or the reproduction, I can snag it and hopefully eventually match them up one day. And be sure to turn on that bell notification, that way YouTube might tell you 2 days or 2 weeks after I post a video. And friends, if you would like to see these actually come to life in a real, made-up version of repro versus vintage coming to life, make sure you head over to my Ko-fi link so that way you can help donate toward that end. And when in doubt, stay beautiful, friends. We'll see y'all next time. My name is Stephanie Canada. In case you couldn't tell it, because that's my channel name and I'm really creative. Oh hey, you're finally done power washing! Yay! Because if it isn't trash people, then it's power washing. In this one, yes indeed, we will be dealing with... I don't know the number. God, you think I would do this eventually. Insert the SpongeBob thing here, because this is gonna take forever to figure out. Where's M? Oh no, did I do all this and I don't have M? I get that you got the vague shape right, Simplicity. However, let's talk about the nitty-gritty, please. All right, wait, what's your seam allowance on this bitch? You had 1 job. Also, in case you're wondering of, Stephanie, why don't you cut these out so that they're easier to put on here? Because I don't want these in my house.